Hi, my name is Lydia Kasopoulos, and I'm a strategy and emerging technologies advisor with a deep passion for body data tracking and human performance. This set of healthy aging protocol interviews delves into meaningful human connection. I'll be asking people what is meaningful to them in relation to human connection and how they go about cultivating meaningful connection as part of their personal healthy aging protocol. I hope you find this to be of interest. Julia, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me about meaningful human connection. I can't wait to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Lydia. It's so great to be here. My name's Julia Hotz. I'm the author of The Connection Cure. I'm also a journalist who's written for the New York Times, Boston Globe, Scientific American. And yes, meaningful human connection is a big passion of mine. So very excited to speak with you.
And a part of your journalism, which I found very interesting, is that you are a solutions-focused journalist. Could you just say what that means?
Sure. Yeah. So solutions journalism is about rigorously reporting on responses to problems. The same way that you would investigate, problem focused stories. Our organization is spreading this practice of solutions journalism, investigating solutions focused stories. So, how is the world responding to the climate crisis? How is the world responding to health inequities? That sort of thing.
So it's more proactive instead of just talking about the problem. It's like, here's the problem, but here's a solution instead of leaving people hanging.
Exactly. Right. It's that, of course, we need to hear stories about everything going wrong in the world, but we also need to hear stories about what people are doing to address it so that we can have some hope, so that cities and governments can be held accountable. They know that these problems are not unsolvable. And that's actually what led me to write this book as well.
That's so amazing. And we're going to get into that as we talk about meaningful human connection. But before that, I want to know, what is your healthy aging protocol?
So, in the research for this book, I was really interested in healthy aging as it pertains to loneliness. There's a lot of data right now suggesting that loneliness is really bad for our health, particularly in older age. It carries consequences akin to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so, in this research around loneliness and healthy aging, one sort of key insight is this idea that actually having strong social relationships can ward off some of these effects. Maybe your listeners are familiar with this really famous Harvard study, the Harvard study of adult development, which found after 85 years of following the same group of people, the number one predictor of their health later in life and longevity was the strength of their social connections. So I think healthy aging comes from actively seeking and maintaining social connections, number one. I also think the research tells us it's really important that we actively engage with our environments as well. One of my favorite researchers in general, but who's done a lot of important work around healthy aging, is Dr. Ellen Langer. And
Mhm.
she's considered by some to be the mother of mindfulness. And today we associate mindfulness with, yoga and deep breathing, that sort of thing. But to Dr. Langer, it was really about being so present in your environment. And when she studied sort of what was later called mindfulness on older adults in this experiment of taking care of a house plant, maybe you know this study,
Mm.
she found that those who had a house plant to take care of in a nursing home
Mhm.
versus those who didn't were more present, more alert, they were healthier. That group lived longer than the control group. And so I think this has gone on to inform a lot of work around aging institutions that A, foster social connection, and B, foster a sense of responsibility and active interaction with the environment, whether it's taking care of a house plant, whether it's bringing in animals to play with, bringing in kids to interact with. All of this, I think, is really good for healthy aging.
And so is that how you go about that in your life? What is that, your healthy aging protocol? Do you have a plant at home? What do you do? How do you make it applied in your world?
Yeah, so all this I think comes down to practices in my own life. I'm looking right now. I have three plants in this room. And I'll say that, it's not something I actively think about necessarily as healthy aging, because I think it's just healthy living. When I hear
Mm.
aging, I think really about my parents, for example, who are in their 70s now. And with them, it's looked like encouraging them to, go have dinner parties with their friends. My dad really loves his garden. My mom's taken up Pilates. It's just about actively engaging, I think, with other people and their environment.
That's wonderful. So perhaps the connection or active engagement protocol is what I guess yours could be called.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that's it. We have this idea. I mean, this is something that I learned from Dr. Langer and has informed a lot of this work around the connection cure and social prescribing is we have this idea that as we get older, as we get sicker, we like people to take care of everything for us, right? But actually, that's not true. That's not actually so
Hmm.
healthy. It's really healthy to still have, even and especially into your later life, a sense of control over your environment. It's really important people feel like they
Hmm.
can make choices. It's really important
Yeah.
all throughout their life, people feel like the choices that they make every day actually have an effect on the world. So I think you said it beautifully. Active engagement, I think, is really the key to healthy aging.
So let's move into the meaningful human connection. So we already established that we're on the same page about how meaningful human connection is important for healthy aging. What does it first mean to you when you hear meaningful human connection? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so I guess again, in terms of the connection cure and thinking about these questions in terms of loneliness, I think it's first of all important to establish that the meaningful part, right? All human connection is not equal. Loneliness is
Hmm.
not the same as being alone. You could be lonely in a crowd. And for guidance on this, I look to the late neuroscientist, Dr. John Cacioppo, who was
Hmm.
really a pioneer in studying the ways that loneliness affects our health and conversely how strong social connections really improve our health. And he was one of the first people to put this idea on the map that without meaningful human connection, without strong social connections,
Hmm.
our health suffers. And this has a very sound evolutionary basis, right? Like you think about
Hmm.
how did we evolve? How did we survive and thrive? We needed to be able to connect with the group to protect us. So
Hmm.
I think, of course, today that looks different where we've got the surviving down, the thriving's a bit harder. And in terms of cultivating those meaningful social connections, the research also tells us that number one, it's really important that you feel you have things in common with another person in order to forge closeness. This is why some people might have seen Dr. Arthur Aaron's sort of misnamed New York Times article, The 36 Questions That Lead to Love.
I saw that.
Some of those questions, right, are about establishing that, wow, you have things in common with this person. You've shared life experiences, you share interests. But he also says it goes beyond that because once you sort of have that baseline of common interests, the next thing is to feel like this person is somebody you can rely on, somebody who supports you, somebody you could trust, somebody who actually makes you feel like you understand yourself a little bit better after being with them.
Hmm.
This also comes down to an evolutionary theory from the same researcher behind these questions. And it's the theory of self expansion, the idea that we seek meaningful, close relationships so we can better understand ourselves. So I think meaningful human connection, it comes down to that. It's not just the physical presence of being with another person. It's not just going
Hmm.
through small talk with which everyone hates. It's feeling like, hey, I actually, one, feel like me and this person have interests and experiences in common. And number two, I think that by spending time with them, I'm actually going to get to understand myself a little bit better. So I
Hmm.
think it really comes down to those two qualities.
That is fascinating because it also mirrors some of what we are seeing when it comes to like the love research about like how marriage is changing and the social construct of it is changing. How in the past it was more about kind of like love and before then it was really about economics. But today it's about self-actualization.
Yeah.
And so you're just bringing that back. You were saying that about self-expansion and getting to know yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Mm-hmm.
indeed can be very meaningful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think that the same, there's a lot of The Connection Cure is just one of many books that came out this year on this subject of connection, even that has connection in the title, because I think that for a long time we've talked about this research in terms of love, in terms of romantic love. Like, how do you build a marriage that lasts? What are the secrets
Mhm.
to a strong romantic partnership? But I think given, the epidemic of loneliness, and given the way that all of these seemingly unrelated ailments like depression and anxiety, even ADHD, stress, are in some ways related, I think, to the absence of meaningful human connection, we're seeing more and more research and reporting actually applying these theories to friendship as well. So, in other words, I think that some of the same principles that we've relied on to help us think about marriage, this should be with somebody that you feel like you can trust, that gives you a sense of home. We should
Mhm.
start talking and thinking about our friends in the same way too. Um, Especially because, there has also been more attention paid to the fact that we're sort of seeing this decline of third spaces. We're sort of seeing this decline of, civic life in the community. There's the famous Dr. Robert Putnam has a book, Bowling Alone, to get at this idea that more Americans are bowling now than they ever have before, but actually the number of bowling leagues has decreased. In other words, people are bowling alone. So this is a long-winded way of saying that I think, even though it might sound a little bit absurd to think that bowling leagues were your source of meaningful human connection, I think they were for a lot of people, these sort of third spaces, civic life that's not quite the workplace, not quite the home, where people really, to your point, got to explore who they are, got to expand themselves through connections with other people.
Well, I would say that we do have third spaces. They've disappeared physically, but then they have appeared digitally. I'm not saying that they are
Mm, mm,
equal in joy. However, they do
yeah.
qualify as third spaces. So social media qualifies as a third space. Metaverse spaces do as well,
Hmm.
gaming worlds as well, but they have declined in the physical space, which has, I'm sure, other ramifications on our ability to interact with each other physically.
That's an interesting point. I've never heard that before, but yeah, I could see that. And I think, look, for a lot of people who, for whatever reason, can't leave their house, my book talks about, for example, this 92-year-old veteran who amazingly is in physical shape, but is really suffering from loneliness because he's 92 years old. He's lost all of his family and friends. He can no longer drive his car. So he's sort of isolated and homebound. And for him, spoiler alert, he gets his dose of meaningful connection from a phone call based social prescription, a volunteer who calls him once a week, who sort of gets actually into these Dr. Aaron guided questions around meaningful human connection. And to your point, I think that everybody, of course, deserves a source of connection like that. I just hadn't heard the term third space applied to, virtual and digital settings, but that makes sense, especially for this population that, has to rely on those spaces.
So I think we've covered the meaningful part really well. So it's having something in common, somebody you could rely on, someone who understands you, but then you also get to understand yourself. So self-expansive in that sense. So how do you go about nourishing, cultivating, and maintaining these relationships?
I think there's sort of three different questions in there. So let's start with the first one. How do you go about cultivating them? I think another reason why these books on connection have really proliferated this year is because it is not as easy as it once was to make friends as an adult. Again, because of these, combining factors, the lack of third spaces, our sort of reliance more and more on digital life. We all work from home. We can get all of our basic needs met in our home. So why do we leave the house, right? There was an article that recently said the average amount of hours Americans spend at home alone has gone up by 2 hours in, I think it was just 5 years ago since they've last done that survey. So, how do we go about finding them? Well, that is where I think this movement for social prescribing comes in. This idea of health workers, doctors, therapists, nurses actually prescribing people non medical community based activities. And the way that they arrive at the ideal social prescription for a person is they ask a variation of the question, what matters to you? Just tell me about what lights you up when you talk about it. Tell me about the last time you experienced awe, or what gives you a state of flow. And so doing that sort of intake work of really getting to understand what matters to a person, they will then prescribe that person a spot in, let's say, an art workshop or a cycling class, or even harkening back to healthy aging for a second, like a dementia care farm is one of the chapters in the book. And so then, once you have that sort of what matters to you basis, there's good news. Not only are you going to be doing an activity that matters to you, but you're going to be surrounded by people who also are connected to that activity in some way, who it also matters for them. And so then with that, we've got, a feeling you have things in common, that out of the way. And then I think actually through the process of doing that activity, whether it's, the book goes to a fishing group, the book goes to these culture vitamins where people are sort of exploring cultural institutions in their communities. It is actually through that activity, I think, that people bond. There's this new term, parallel play, that's sort of cropped up to describe the way that sometimes the work of actually cultivating meaningful human connection is not as direct. It happens sort of through the business of life. And that's where it begins, these social prescriptions. And even if, look, here in the United States, we're a long way from social prescribing becoming mainstream. But in the meantime, we can prescribe ourselves activities that answer that question of what matters to us. So that's the cultivating part.
Yeah.
Now, the maintaining part is interesting. And again, I would defer to a lot of other authors this year. One who comes to mind is Anna Goldfarb. She's got a great book out called Modern Friendship that also sort of describes this phenomenon of the way that our modern life doesn't exactly set us up to be able to maintain modern friendships as we once did. We live further apart, even though, we can connect more easily than ever. We actually really kind of take that for granted. And so I think in the same way of cultivating, it comes from really dedicating time for you and that person to spend together, doing something you both love, and giving that person a chance to self-expand and vice versa. I think what's true in all this research is that nobody likes small talk. Nobody likes, it's very physically uncomfortable, I think, for people to have to engage in small talk, particularly when it's with somebody with whom, you once had a meaningful human connection.
Yeah.
So I think that sort of getting right into the business of self-expansion, of digging deep on those bigger life questions is the key to maintaining that sense of closeness.
It sounds so simple when you say it, when you explain it. Like, just find what means something to you, something you're passionate about, and then go find people who like that too. And then you are right that maintaining it is very difficult these days because of how far apart we are, but then also just how fast modern life is these days and how much more we're doing in a day. So if the time is an issue, how do you go about nourishing it when you're time poor or time constrained? Granted, as we get older and have different life courses, people are going to ebb and flow in and out of our lives. But that in mind, how would you go about maintaining and nourishing, rather, meaningful human connection when you understand that everybody's time poor?
It's a great question. And it's something that I have struggled with myself a lot, particularly in the throes of this book tour. I feel like I feel like time is such a precious resource for me. I never have enough time to do everything I want to do. But I think actually, in some ways, this is our saving grace, because if we had infinite time to forge, to cultivate infinite meaningful connections and maintain infinite meaningful connections, they wouldn't be meaningful. I think actually part of the way that our time crunches can help us is they sort of force us to say, okay, which connections are worth sort of investing in and which can I sort of just let go. Here again, this is something I learned from Anna Goldfarb's book, Modern Friendship, that we actually shed our friendships every 7 years. This was the average person, right? This just totally blew my mind. And at first I heard that and I thought, oh my gosh, that's so sad. And I so feel that. Like, I talk in my book about having this photo wall of people with whom I once considered really, really close friends. And then I took honest stock and said, when was the last time I had a meaningful conversation with that person? Like, besides, texting each other on our birthdays or maybe seeing each other at the occasional wedding or what have you, I really am no longer close with this person. And that's okay, because that time that I once spent on that friendship is now being spent on a friendship that does feel more meaningful and precious to me. Because here's the thing, our friendships change because we change. And so I'm sort of getting around the question, but this is a long-winded way of saying that I actually think we can't have infinite meaningful connections, and which ones we choose to spend our time in should be a reflection of how dear they are to us. Because I also think this is something I learned in the chapter of the book focused on stress and nature prescribing. Like, the sort of scene setting here is that there's this woman who's working 3 jobs and she feels like her to-do list is always expanding and she can never get everything done she wants to in a day. She never has enough time. And so, ironically, she gets prescribed something that will take up more of her time. She gets prescribed a nature course, 2 hours a week doing some sort of meaningful outdoor activity in nature. And at first, I think people's instinct would be, well, how are you going to prescribe her to do something where she's spending more time if she doesn't feel like she has enough time? And here's the thing. I think what she found, which is what we could all, I think, come to agree with if we're feeling like we don't have time, is that not all time is created equal. In other words, these 2 hours a week that she spent in this nature prescription actually made her feel at the end of that more energetic, more restored, like she had sort of a better handle of the stressors on her life. In other words, those 2 hours were a really worthwhile investment of her time because it made her feel like ultimately she had more time, she had more control. It made her more confident to be able to let go of the things that weren't serving her. And I think investing in meaningful human connections is the same. A good friend, a good close relationship shouldn't feel like they drain you or that it's, some sort of obligation that you're dreading. It should feel like, wow, I feel better after being with them. I feel like I have more time than I ever did.
I love that. So, for those who are listening who are like, look, I love this social prescribing stuff, but like, what does it look like? So, you've got in your book movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. Could you give an example for each one just to make it kind of more practical for people who want to like do that?
Sure. Yeah. So part 1 of this book really gets into the science of why those 5 ingredients are so essential for our health. And then it tells the story of 2 people who've been prescribed something in that category. So for movement, for example, it's a cycling course and outdoor sea swimming lessons. For nature, as I mentioned, it's this sort of 10-week outdoor nature excursion course and this fishing club. For art, it's this 8-week creativity workshop and this also multiple week set of culture vitamins, going to museums, going to concerts, going to libraries, even engaging with the arts in some sort of way that you are receiving them. For service, it talks about a woman who was prescribed a spot volunteering for a children's charity and a care farm in which this woman with dementia is prescribed. And then finally, belonging is the one that ideally all of these groups would have a sense of belonging. But even, when you strip away movement, nature, art, and service, there are groups that I think are still just strictly committed to cultivating a sense of belonging. And that is this group called the Black Focus Social Prescribing Project in Canada, where people are going through just a series of community activities together with people who sort of share a cultural background. And also this virtual social prescription program that I mentioned, where people are talking on the phone once a week just to cultivate that strong sense of connection and belonging.
That's perfect. And if people want to find you, follow you, where do they go?
Sure. So they can go to the website that houses this book and lots of resources around social prescribing. It's called socialprescribing.co. And they can find me on socials at Hotz Thoughts. So my last name, Hotz, and thoughts like the ones in your head on Instagram and TikTok and X and YouTube.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. And I think if you could just leave us with, what is the future of connection? Do you have any thoughts about what's next, or what it is you have 5 in this book? Is there going to be a 6th that you think?
Well, I chose those 5 because actually I think that those 5 pillars are ingredients that have guided us long before, we were even conscious of it. Those 5 ingredients, they're healthy because they were key to being able to survive and evolve and thrive. So I don't know if there's going to be a 6th necessarily, but I am so excited about the ways that we are getting more and more creative with those 5. I do think connection is sort of having a renaissance. I think finally the sort of amazing attention that the U.S. Surgeon General and others are paying to the crisis of loneliness is leading this sort of revolution in terms of social prescribing and ways that we really want to revive human connection as a pillar of life, the same way that we would, invest in exercise or healthy eating. Human connection is essential too.
Well, I look forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much. So lovely to be here.
This series is meant to capture personal stories of individual healthy aging protocols and is for informational purposes only, and it does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Those seeking personal medical advice should consult with a licensed healthcare practitioner.